Good morning, everybody. Happy Mardi Gras, and welcome back to WITC's 2024 Washington International Trade Conference. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's program, and we're pleased you can be with us again today. Either those of you who are here in the room and those of you who are online, welcome. For those of you on Zoom, a reminder that your Zoom link for today will work all day, so if you have to log off and log back on, the same link you used to get on just now will work for the rest of the day. For those of you who are here in the Reagan Building, welcome. We're delighted you could join us. We have a terrific buffet lunch later in the program. Special thanks to our sponsors for their support for this year's conference, our benefactors, Amazon, UPS, Trade Data Monitor, and the National Pork Producers Council, our executive sponsor, Business Roundtable, and our patrons, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, National Retail Federation, Aluminum Association, Express Association of America, and Trade Center Management Associates and the International Trade Center, our hosts at this lovely venue. We have a diverse set of speakers today and hope to cover a lot of ground. To introduce our first speaker, I'd like to welcome to the stage Michael Mullen of the Express Association of America.
Well, thanks very much, Ken, and it's a delight to be here with you today and have the honor to introduce one of our speakers. So when CEOs are asked what keeps them up at night, the most common answer is uncertainty. The inability to see what's coming next is the major problem with which both business and government planners struggle. So we're fortunate today to have with us Robert Moran, a partner with the Brunswick Group, who has pioneered a highly effective approach to predicting the future by examining the major trends underway today and the direction they are likely to take going forward. Mr. Moran heads Brunswick Insight, a team of public opinion and market research experts spread across 3 continents who provide rapid analysis and strategic advice to support senior decision-making and corporate communications programs. Mr. Moran was previously president of Strategy One's U.S. operations, which is Edelman's strategic research consultancy. Prior to that, he was vice president at Fabrizio McLaughlin and Associates. So please join me in welcoming Robert Moran.
Good morning, and happy Mardi Gras, which Ken mentioned just a minute ago. So at your tables today, you should have this handout, which is an infographic which I'll be speaking from, which covers the 20 trends that I'm going to be walking through today. And what I'm going to do is top line these trends for about 30 minutes and then open it to questions so we can mix it up a bit and have fun with that. So let's get started. So they say that forewarned is forearmed, and our annual horizon scan helps leaders prepare for the year ahead. Unfortunately, 2024 is shaping up to be a very turbulent year where resilience is critical. Now, as I'm walking through these trends, I think it's helpful for leaders to think about these as a kind of intellectual sandbox where you start to pressure test what your strategy is for your organization and how each of these trends might impact your organization collectively. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process of how we did this, because I think it's important, as they say, to show our homework here. So every trend that you see is a combination of what foresight experts call steep trends. That stands for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political trends. So we basically, our team goes and looks at all of the steep categories, social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, and then starts to put those together into a forecast for each year. This is a very standard foresight tool. Now, Some of the trends that I'm going to talk about today are what we call long wave or mega trends. These are going to take a generation or longer to go through. So I'm going to give you some examples that aren't in the forecast, but that are just mega trends that everybody needs to be aware of. So global urbanization. The world over time has urbanized at a fairly rapid rate in the 20th and now 21st century. That's one big one, right? The second big one is the rise of the global middle class. Those are, we don't put them in this forecast because those are sort of obvious megatrends. But some of the bigger megatrends I'm talking about today are what really drive society forward, and those are the ones you need to pressure test your business and your organization against. We also have some trends that are much smaller but very stochastic. In other words, they'll pop in any given year. And those are sort of where the wild card scenarios start to come in. Now, there's deep value in connecting different trends. So I'm going to walk you through 20. But what you should be thinking along with me is how might one trend connect to another and create an opportunity or a challenge for your business or organization. I'm going to give you an example that is very common among futurists that futurists always use. The drive-in movie craze of the 50s and 60s in America. So that hit America by storm. People are like, wow, how did that happen? Okay, if you were a futurist, you would have said the following way in advance. America has a baby boom. America loves cars. We have the Eisenhower highway system being built. Americans love movies. You combine youth and mobility and movies with affluence post-war, and you get the drive-in movie. So today, as I'm walking through these, try to think about what the drive-in movie might be of the future for your organization. Okay, now, to explain a little bit more about how we built this forecast, it's important to note that we reviewed 31 different global forecasts and studies from a cross-section of analytical groups, including DARPA, Deloitte, McKinsey, Pew Research Center, Brookings, Gallup, Edelman, WHO, CSIS, World Economic Forum, et cetera. We took a range of their forecasts and studies and made a meta-analysis to build this. We also listened for what are called weak signals, which are very early sort of signals or green shoots of change that we want to take a look at that give us pause, that could be harbingers of a much bigger change in the future. Okay, so with that said, get your infographic ready and I'll walk you through each one of these. So the first is macroeconomic turbulence. That's our biggest driver for the year. Technological disruption would already be enough of a challenge for most organizations. If you think about digitization and AI and everything else that's going on, deep fakes, which we'll talk about momentarily. But we are now dealing with war, power blocks, and managed trade, along with trade protectionism. And all of those combined with the technological disruption we have, and a number of other trends, which I'm going to walk you through, create a less than stable economic system that we are going to experience. And so the likelihood that something not so great happens in this year, and from a macroeconomic standpoint, is pretty high. And so that's why we will need to make sure we're wearing our seatbelts. The second is the empty cradle. So most of the world's societies are aging, and aging dramatically. And this is likely to do a number of things. Number one, it's likely to slow economic growth. Number two, it's likely to bankrupt governments. Number three, it's likely to drive automation because there'll be fewer workers. So because of that worker shortage, you're going to increase automation, especially in sort of nursing home and elder care and things like that. So the challenge here, and we're going to talk about this in relation to Asia in just a minute, is that societies grow the fastest, and those who have an economics background have heard this a million times, but there's something called the demographic window. Societies grow the fastest when they're in the demographic window. That means they have very few children and very few older people, and they have a lot of people in their peak working years. When you get out of that, the economy in that nation tends to slow. And so that will be a bigger problem, not just in Western Europe, but especially in Asia, which has really powered the global economy. The U.S. has a slowing birth rate as well, but as an immigrant society, we have sort of an ability to attract new talent, and other societies don't necessarily have that kind of orientation towards immigration. So societies like America and Brazil, who have been immigration driven, may have the ability to stay younger relative to the rest of the world if they play their immigration cards correctly. That brings us to the third big trend, which is graying Asia. Most nations are aging rapidly. The Pacific Rim has been the world's economic engine, but that engine is going to slow. It's not just, for example, Japan. So most of you are thinking Japan when you think about Asia and aging, but South Korea is aging just as rapidly, if not faster. And the big question then becomes China, which is aging very rapidly. By 2030, China's median age will be 5 years older than the USA, and by 2033, China's old age dependency will be higher than the US. By 2035, 30% of China is projected to be over 60. And deaths in China outnumbered births in 2022. That was the first time since 1961. The old adage is, that China needs to get rich before it gets old. The problem that China has is it's old and getting old quickly. And that's going to slow the global growth rate. And this exacerbates a number of problems that China already has, the so-called 3Ds of debt, deflation, and of course, demography. So graying Asia, or the gray tsunami, is a very significant trend that we're going to see this year, but it's going to play out across time. You also see Xi calling for Chinese women to have more children, and the repeal of the one-child policy, or stepping back away from it, et cetera. And those are all attempts to deal with this challenge. 4, the race for AI superiority. There's a concept in military history called the revolution in military affairs, which posits that the first power to successfully weaponize a new technology gains hegemony. So think bronze, iron, chariots, gunpowder, steam power, air power, atomic weapons, cyber, AI, and now we have AI. So what's going on here is nation states are racing for that superiority to weaponize a new technology. And the first that figures out how to weaponize that technology then has the upper hand. The challenge with AI is it's one of those exponential technologies that's hard for others to catch up to the leader. And that's what every nation state knows, and that's why we have this AI sort of arms race going on. But it's not just nation states, it's also corporations and businesses. And the question is, how will businesses and nation states operate in a way that they can essentially try to gain the upper hand with artificial intelligence? And here I'm talking not just about large language models, but not just about generative AI, which just has made a lot of headlines, but eventually we're talking about artificial general intelligence, which is actual thinking, as opposed to sort of what a large language model is today. Number 5, power blocks. So we are likely living in the early days of World War V. So the First World War was actually the 7 Years' War. The Second World War was World War I. The Third World War was World War II. The Fourth World War was the Cold War. And we are probably in something we will look back on as the Fifth World War. And you can see this in the power blocks that are developing and have been developed over time. And then we have a non-aligned block, just like we had during the Cold War. And that is driving and will drive quite a bit of how we experience 2024. I don't have to go into all the details to talk about the conflict zones in the world that we have right now, including Ukraine, et cetera, and all the discussions around Taiwan, but that is what we are talking about. Number 6, deep fakes and the crisis of authenticity. The question here is what is real and what is not real? And that is something that societies are going to struggle with because of the technology, the deep fake technology that Hollywood, et cetera, are already using. And in the near future, nation states and fraudsters are going to use this to confuse and deceive adversaries. And so, for example, in the near future, some deep fake fraudster is going to replicate a CEO saying something that is not true and not real to try to manipulate the stock market. And we're going to have a discussion about how we regulate this, which will be almost impossible to do. And then we're going to have a discussion about how we authenticate information. And so corporate communicators are going to have to think very long and hard about how we authenticate the communication. My view is it'll probably be authenticated by venue and official sources. And so we're going to have to think through this as a society. The American government and other governments will have to think through this as well. And so deep fakes are something that we will need to come to grips with here, especially in 2024. Number 7, mineral nationalism. We have an issue right now, which is that every major country knows that it needs to make the energy transition. Okay, but the energy transition requires batteries and electrification, and that requires a whole host of minerals, including lithium and copper. And so if you're interested in this topic, you can read the book that just came out, The War Below. But essentially, every major nation state is going to be competing for resources, especially minerals, lithium, copper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to try to friend source those minerals. What it will also mean is that countries like the United States are going to have to expand mining and approve more extraction. They will have to do that. And they will eventually do it for the best of reasons, including for environmental reasons. So there's going to be a discussion around that. Number 8, labor empowerment. This is a trend that we've been tracking for a very long time. You have 2 competing data points. The U.S. is at a relative low in terms of its percentage of unionization, but has the highest public support for unions that it's had in the last 60 years in public polling. And you could see this over the last summer with so-called the hot strike summer and other labor activity. That labor activity within historic standards is still quite low, but was much higher than most years. Labor has not captured all the gains of efficiency that we've made over the last 20, 30 years. And so this is an attempt by the people, by organized labor, to take back some of those gains. So we think that labor empowerment is a trend to watch. It may not look like the old 19th and 20th century labor movements. We're probably talking about unionization of service sector employees and things like this. And it may look more like medieval guilds than 20th century unions. Number 9, sovereign and municipal debt. I think it's fairly obvious that public debt levels are simply unsustainable. You combine them with an aging population and there will be a reckoning. Several sovereigns and U.S. states will likely go bankrupt in the process. Public debt hit a record $92 trillion in 2022, and 3.3 billion people live in countries in which interest payments are greater than spending on health or education. The UN Secretary General of Trade and Development calls global debt one of, quote, the biggest threats to global peace and security. And that will not end well. Okay, number 10, obesity costs. The World Obesity Federation predicts that over half of the global population, 4 billion people, will be obese by 2035. That will create an unsustainable cost for nation states. The healthcare knock-on effects are just simply too great. It's connected to too many NCDs. And so what will happen is governments will be forced to push fitness efforts and weight loss drugs. Now, this was a predictable outcome as the world urbanizes, because as the world urbanizes, it tends to gain weight. So we could have seen this coming, and we did. Obesity costs between 4 and 9% of U.S. GDP annually. And so you could see this will be viewed as a way that we can sort of gain some cost savings by getting the population healthier. Number 11, data security. I won't go too heavily into that. That's been on our radar for a long time. It's now a cost of doing business for most corporations. Eventually, the cost will be so high that nation states will regard it more as a violent attack and less as something that's sort of done in the ether. Number 12, youth mental health. We've been tracking this for years as mental health broadly, which then spiked as an issue during COVID. But the data shows that post-COVID, this crisis is the most acute among teenage girls. And teenage girls are driving a huge percentage of the calls into mental health hotlines, et cetera, and clinical visits. And so nation states around the world are going to be thinking about how they can help teens, and specifically teenage girls, deal with this. So for example, mental health visits grew 20% between 2019 and 2022. Among those under 18, eating disorder visits are up 90%, anxiety-related visits are up 39%, and depression-related visits are up 24%. And 14% of global youth experience mental health concerns, most commonly anxiety and depression. There's a wider issue going on here, which is so-called deaths from despair, which I think you all have heard of and read about before. And this is also part of a much bigger trend about us trying to put context around the mental health impact of COVID and its aftermath, which is a very good New York Times article written about it yesterday. Okay, 13, green energy, which is tied to mining and a range of other things. Is the bottom line is if nation states want to make the energy transition, they need minerals, they need mining. There's no way around it. And essentially, the growth rate is now at a point where green energy and clean tech is really taking off. For example, wind and solar provided 14% of global electricity in the H1 of 2023, up from 12.8% in H1 2022. At some point, you get a critical mass of these technologies, and they just start to build on themselves because they have economies of scale. But the choke point here is minerals. Okay, 14. Climate and conflict mitigation. We raise this because almost everything in our horizon scan this year was bad news and competitive. However, we did see a silver lining here, which is some of these threats to the world in terms of climate conflict are so extreme that they're driving international cooperation as well. And so we do posit that some of the climate and carbon threats may end up being, when historians look back at this time, as something that helped bring the world together as a countervailing trend. Okay, number 15, water and food security. The fact is the world produces enough food to feed everyone. We have a distributional problem, or warlords use it to gain leverage on a population that they want to manage out, et cetera. But the water and food security is a distributional issue generally. Climate change and war have stressed food markets, but the real issue behind all of it is really fresh water. And we are in a freshwater deficit in most of the world. By 2030, the Earth will have a freshwater deficit of 40%, with 1.6 billion people lacking safe drinking water. So 80% of wastewater globally is just discharged untreated. So the world is going to have to come to grips with that, and also trying to manage some of the food security issues we have from conflicts around the world. Number 16, AI productivity. So if we're lucky, AI will end up creating the kind of wealth that the railroads created in America in the 1870s and 1880s. I think that's pretty likely, in fact. Now, I want to try to blow up some of the scaremongering that's happening around AI. There have been 3 phases of discussion around automation and AI. Phase 1 was job automation fears. A number of economists took all the SIC codes, all the job codes in America, thank you, Labor Department, and then ran likelihood of automation estimates for each job code. And if you remember back, this was like 6-8 years ago, there was a lot of fear about what jobs would be automated or not. Okay. That was round 1. Phase 2 was McKinsey and other consulting firms coming in and saying, not so fast, because look, what's going to happen is tradition, cultural acceptance, unions, governments, et cetera, will slow down the rate of automation. The third wave of the discussion, which we are now in, was driven by the Royal Society, which their researchers realized that what's happening here is a job is not a single unit. A job is a task, is a stack of tasks. Each task can be automated. Jobs aren't automated, tasks are automated. If you have a job that is one task, you have a higher rate of automation possibility. But if you have a job that has 30 different tasks, well, one of those tasks may get automated and make you actually a more valuable worker because you can use that technology to produce more. And that's the discussion we're at now. So what will happen is we will learn to race with the machine, not against it. And for most workers, it will make them even more valuable. The question is how workers capture that value. Okay, almost finished. Loneliness epidemic. This is part of the knock-on effects of the decline and unbundling of religion. The WHO made loneliness a global health priority, and research has found a decline in the percentage of people with close friends. So the antidote to this is social capital, is architecture and urban planning that creates new spaces for people to meet, and also festivals that create connection, like Mardi Gras, which we're in today. And so the loneliness epidemic is something that organizations and especially governments are going to look at. Governments about 10 years ago started looking at happiness and trying to study happiness. The UAE spent a lot of money trying to study happiness. But we also need to figure out loneliness and help fight loneliness, which means we need to help people get reconnected. We need to look at societies, cities, people groups that have a high rate of social connection and try to understand how they architect social connection into their lives. Number 18, political polarization. I don't need to tell people in Washington about political polarization. We've lived through it. It is a challenge. It is a challenge for businesses to navigate. 19, this is less germane to a trade-related conference, but autonomous weapon swarms are going to be a big deal. And what I mean by this is imagine thousands of drones operating together sort of as a swarm, collectively, autonomously. And this allows an aggressor to use a cheaper technology, drones, to attack a larger defensive fixed target. We've had this push and pull in military history over the years. You can go back to longbows and knights. You have knights at the apex of society with all the armor and all the attendants and everything else in a society built around that warrior class that could then be killed by a simple archer with a longbow. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. So the societies and the militaries that learn to advance very large, we're talking about thousands of drones working together to attack targets, will have military hegemony. And then finally, grid hardening. Okay, on September 2nd, 1859, in the American West, telegraph operators saw sparks coming off their telegraphs. All sorts of weird things happened with anything that had wiring. Fortunately, we didn't have many things with wiring in 1859. We had telegraphs, and telegraphs went crazy on September 2nd, 1859. Why? The people at the time didn't know why. What had happened was the sun had emitted a plasma, and it hit North America really hard. This happens every couple centuries. It happens all the time in limited bursts. It happened in Montreal back in the 1990s and shut down power for a while. And it's called a Carrington event. You can Google it and read all about it. It's fascinating. But it's essentially nature's version of an EMP attack, okay? Every major country knows about these, and they know what a threat it is, because either it happens naturally from the sun or it happens from an aggressor, but it knocks out your grid. You've seen in the Ukraine conflict how important the grid is. And so if a nation state's grid is knocked out, it can be knocked out for a long time if it is EMP'd. And so you're going to see nation states around the world hardening their grids, which will create economic incentives to basically build more resilience into all of the core infrastructure. Okay, so those are our 20 trends for 2024, and happy to take questions for a few minutes. Great. Yep.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for this great presentation. And on the grid hardening, I live here in Arlington, Virginia, where a small windstorm can knock out our electricity. So grid hardening would be a good thing, at least locally, I would think, in some places. Can I ask you just a little bit about your trends? And can you help us understand root causes versus impacts? So I think in the international trade space, we're seeing a lot of protectionism in the United States. I think that's rising out of fears among non-college educated men, primarily. That's driving some of the things you have here in your trends, other factors as well. But I'm just wondering, maybe if you could articulate a little bit, which of these are kind of root issues and which of these are kind of the secondary effects of what are probably some root issues that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, the root issues are really driven, the root issues are really around technological change and who wins and who loses, and the losers trying to catch up in what they're doing, and also nation-state rivalry. But to talk a little bit more about protectionism, this was about 8 years ago. We ran a very large global study asking a range of questions about how people think about the future, et cetera. And when we started looking at the data, what we realized was people who lived in global megacities across the world, didn't matter what society they were in, had similar views, which were much more optimistic about the world. If you weren't living in a global megacity, you were much more pessimistic, and you felt like you were falling behind. And so this was before the 2016 election that we saw this, but it really raised the question about what's going on here. And the answer is that basically folks who are tied into a global megacity, who are part of the international sort of economic community that's driving forward, they're getting more of the gains than people in second and third tier cities are. And so they have very radically different views. And so that's why you could see this in our politics around the world to this day. Yes.
I'd rather talk about trade than obesity, but you fascinate me by saying that obesity is such a big problem that it costs so much that we have to do something about it. The worry would be that the government has to tell you what you can eat and what you can weigh, and that would not be a good thing.
So it might not be the government, it might be, other organizations, your employer, other things like that. But if you look at it, non-communicable diseases are a huge cost driver in health systems, right? And so obesity has a number of knock-on non-communicable diseases, especially diabetes. And so the question is, how do we help people get fitter? Because simply it's a huge cost. And so, you can have discussions about sort of energy balance and walking cities and walking places and that kind of a thing. But over time, I expect a technological or pharmacological fix is what people will go for. Or some other semaglutide.
Hi, you talked about the importance of minerals, lithium and all of that. What are the implications in terms of geopolitics as it relates to most of those minerals are on the continent of Africa?
That's right. That's a great point. So I'm going to go back to my notes here. So as you pointed out, Zimbabwe, Indonesia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chile, and others have announced new taxes and/or export bans on minerals. Now, the United States, from its perspective, is going to look at how to friend source minerals from various countries, but we'll also have to ramp up domestic production. And there are articles every day coming out about potential lithium mining in the United States, but copper is important. Now, an interesting thing for sort of hemispheric trade in the Western Hemisphere is that the U.S. has a number of these minerals, but miners are not allowed yet to access them. But also, Latin America, South America is blessed with an enormous amount of the minerals needed for production of batteries. And so I suspect that you're going to see this big surge in hemispheric trade in order to secure all those materials. There's a secondary issue in regards to some of these countries, which is that there is a question around essentially worker treatment and how those minerals are processed. So traditionally, a warlord will take control of the smelter and essentially enslave the people who are providing the minerals and the smelting. And so how societies deal with that and sort of labor standards in regards to that extraction is going to be a very, very big deal as well. But I think the big impact, at least in this country, is going to be the country will have to have a conversation. The conversation will ultimately end in the decision to allow a lot more mining, because it's the only way we can get the energy transition done. So eventually, a critical mass of environmentalists will support new mining, because it's the only way we can support the battery technology to get the energy transition that we want, which is probably a hard pill to swallow for many environmentalists, but I think is inevitable at this point.
I don't see any reference to guns. What do you think? I mean, do you think American or world gun policy needs to change, will change? You talk about other kinds of, because I was even relating it when you talked about youth mental health and about the problem with girls. The one advantage girls have is they have less exposure generally to guns. As I understand it, boys have a higher suicide rate because they are successful committing suicide. So between crime and mental health.
So this is a global forecast, and America has a unique gun culture. And not only that, but we tend not to talk about this in crime generally because it's a sort of base level issue for most societies. But the issue is if we were to do that, if we were to talk about firearms and this was a simply American focus, then we would be having a different discussion. But this is a global, and other countries have very different gun cultures, as you know. So.
Are you optimistic? In other words, is this all going to turn out okay, or are we heading towards some huge catastrophe, which any one of these 20 things could produce?
So I'm by nature an optimist, personally. But that's probably because of my cultural matrix as an American. If you look at all these together, we'll be lucky to get out of the next 20 years without a major global conflict. We'll be lucky to get out of this without a Great Depression. It's hard to look at this and have a lot of optimism. Now, humans are very resilient and resourceful, and we've been through world wars, we've been through global depressions, but if you look at this, I think any analysis is pretty stark about this. You could see that most nation states are acting from a point of view that there are some challenges ahead. So, not to bring everyone down, but we're going to be lucky to get out of this one okay.
We have a question from our audience on Zoom. Do you think these trends will end up making people, and more importantly, companies, feel more liberal or protective about their proprietary data? Will they be less willing to share more digital benefits, or will they be willing to share to avoid potential exploitation of their data?
So I suspect that organizations and especially companies are going to look at their information as a value source and source of competitive advantage and try to put walled gardens around that data. You see this right now with a number of legal wranglings around large language models and authors suing the makers of large language models. From a purely capitalistic standpoint, if I have a corporation and I have valuable data, I don't want to share it. I want to monetize it. And my stakeholders, especially my shareholders, expect me to do so. So there's not really a lot of incentive for me to share information. Nation states are very different. I mean, we're blessed. Most of us are living in the United States who are listening to this, and we have fantastic data sources from our government, which are open source and remarkably accurate. And so I think those data points can be mined, like BLS data, et cetera. But I suspect that most corporations and most businesses will build walled gardens around their data to protect that value.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about all of these trends and these forecasts. I like the way that you started off the discussion discussing on behalf of sort of futurists. And what I wanted to ask you was, considering, the aging working population, but also coupled with advancing technology the way that it is, and sort of also the way you speak about, youth mental health and the way that young people are starting to work. My question is, coupled with all of these things kept in mind, how do futurists envision, bringing people back to the workspace, using technology as a tool, but also, in an age of extreme political polarization, how do futurists see bringing people back into these sorts of workspaces?
Right. So that's a wonderful question. And, I think right now we've been in this long-term discussion now ever since COVID about what the workplace is and what it's meant to do and designed to do. So keep in mind when we went through COVID and we shut down a range of business activities or convening activities, we kept the physical workplaces for essential workers open, like hospitals, nurses, production, meat packing, all that kind of stuff. A huge range of Americans, a huge range of workers have to go to a physical place to do their work. So think people that work at the pharmacy, any essential workers, people that deliver the mail, people who are making products, people who are shipping food, all that. All that is a physically linked job. Then there are people that can do, intellectual workers that can do their job remotely. I think for that category, the question is, what is a workplace? And what is a workplace for? I suspect it is for social connection and new ideas ultimately in the future, and not necessarily for like day-to-day work. But I also want to expand people's view about what a workplace could look like in the future. So, and I just finished a novel in which some of the villains meet in cyberspace in a video game, and like many terrorist organizations, they meet in a video game and plan their attacks. So, but what if that's what work looks like in the future, where you work in VR in a game? So during COVID, for example, some people met in Red Dead Redemption, the video game, and they met around the campfire and talked, and that's where I got inspiration in my novel for. But the workplace could look like that, where you meet in VR and a global team meets. So we don't know exactly what that looks like, but humans are tribes and they create folkways. And so I think in reality, what corporations need to do is think more about the workforce from an anthropological and sociological perspective. What are the folkways, right? And what gives people meaning? Humans have a deep need for contribution and being part of a team. And so I think the workplace of the future allows them to feel that, and routine is really important. Getting coffee, people taking smoke breaks, whatever it is, those kind of routines are what are the fabric of life. And so that's why you hear some corporate leaders really wanting people back in the office. I think it's going to be some kind of a hybrid approach, but it's a really interesting issue. And just to follow up on this on one other thing, futurists talk about quite a bit, which is that you have two other big trends going on. One is the individual as their own corporation, right? The side hustle, the side gig, all that kind of stuff, and people using other workspaces anywhere, cafes, et cetera, because they are a corporation of one, right? So you have that, plus you have in larger employers, multiple generations having to figure out how to work together. And this is a real big challenge right now. You've got Gen Z, you've got millennials, you've got Gen X, and you have boomers. Four very different generations within the American context. Each society has a somewhat different structure in that. But in the American context, 4 generations trying to find out ways to work together who have very different political views and philosophical views, all banging into each other in the workplace. And so corporations are really struggling with that as well.
Thank you. Well, 2 questions quickly. On your number 5, do you really consider BRICS as a bloc or as a sort of grouping of people with very conflicting interests? And if your 20 points as a whole are sort of huge challenge, aren't most of these points huge opportunities for companies like obesity? That means if you are a pharmaceutical company, it's billions, trillions of dollars.
Yes, that's right. That's right. There's a lot of opportunity in these forecasts, especially for like defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, you name it, mobility, water treatment. Water treatment's a huge long-term trend. Even concrete, which is not exactly the environmentalist's favorite building material, but future's pretty bright for aggregates, construction materials. Okay, one last question. Oh. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. You talked about labor and grid hardening and AI, and there's often talk about immigration reform. So are corporations afraid of losing the ability to engage in the international trade for skilled laborers, for example, extraordinary ability, exceptional ability, other skilled laborers like IT? Mm-hmm. So are corporations afraid of losing this edge of continuing to basically maintain a foothold in world hegemony in their sectors?
So to answer the questions really quickly, yes, and the United States and other nations will eventually reform their immigration laws in an effort to basically grab the tech workers that they need for the future, but also to increase immigration levels so that the societies don't age as rapidly. So that, the United States should increase immigration levels so that we do not age as rapidly and we can continue to grow. So that's a very rational strategy. Tax policy, given the debt levels and spending, nation states will have no recourse but to basically cut their debt and increase taxes. They're going to go after tax havens and any other sort of alternative investments that are trying to get around those. So I don't see how you can't get around that without, as a nation state, raising taxes and going after tax havens. Okay, thank you.